Okay, so here's some feedback on the questions for discussion board 3. Our first question is from Sarah. I thought the need to have control because you could have an administrator who makes you use traditional teaching methods was interesting. I'm wondering how common this scenario is. I'm also questioning what exactly a traditional teaching method preference entails. I'm not understanding too much of the question there, but one part of it I do understand is the way that often in school situations there may be a conflict between the teacher and the administrator in terms of the particular types of teaching that's going on. Typically, an administrator would like to walk down the aisles of the school and see students quiet and working at their desks. Well, clearly, that's not the kind of model of language teaching practice that we want to embrace. What we want is to have students actually practicing the language. So one of the problems, say, with communicative approaches, pair work, group work, is it does generate a lot of noise. From the teacher's perspective, it's the noise of students trying to communicate in a second language, which of course is a wonderful sound. But for the administrator, it's the sound of a teacher who is not in control of his class and students should be quiet and working. So that's a very traditional view of the classroom, uh, um, contrasted with a communicative language teaching view of the classroom, where we want to have students talking and maybe walking around the classroom and communicating and doing those kinds of things. So that's, in a sense, putting together communicative language teaching goals and contrasted with traditional educational goals. James asks, Chapter 19 discusses several factors that affect a learner's pronunciation, including the role of motivation. Brown notes that some learners will not be concerned with pronunciation. He mentions that we as instructors can help facilitate pronunciation motivation by showing how clarity of speech is significant. How else can we motivate learners to value clear pronunciation? Well, difficult question to answer. One explanation of why students may not want to try to aspire to an authentic accent is that they are preserving an identity. So the very fact that we don't want to sound like a native speaker is suggesting that we want to keep hold of our identity as a native speaker in our own language. So very much the way we speak and the choice of the words in our first language and our second language is really bound up with identity. So in many ways, one way to kind of improve pronunciation is really on a very sociolinguistic level of working on identity and working on breaking down fears of losing identity. One way of doing that, of encouraging that view of identity, is to show learners role models, that is, people who are perhaps very well known, who have successfully mastered a second language. And that can often come as quite a surprise to language learners. Take, for example, people like the basketball player Kobe Bryant. He grew up in Italy. His dad was a coach, basketball coach, and player in Italy. And you can go to YouTube and put in Kobe Bryant interview in Italian, and you'll hear some pretty fantastic Italian from Kobe Bryant. So when a student sees that, what they can see is that a role model is doing something and showing that they're not losing any identity, but and that's something that students can aspire to. And you can also Google celebrities who speak a foreign language, and you'll find out, for example, that J.K. Rowling is pretty fluent in French because she was a French teacher before she became a writer. You'll find out that Gwyneth Paltrow is an excellent expert speaker of Spanish. You'll find out that Natalie Portman is a fluent speaker of Hebrew, and that Leonardo DiCaprio speaks a pretty mean German from his German side of his family. Um, Also, check out Bradley Cooper. His French is astonishingly good. Okay, so that's a way of working with role models and identity. Um, Kacie says, in a classroom, you encounter students with very different personalities and opinions. What is the best way to find common ground when putting students in pairs groups? Also, if one student tends to be controlling or is leading the conversation, accidentally not allowing other students the chance to speak, how do you recognize and handle this as a teacher? Well, recognizing this, of course, is the realization that the teacher should be an ethnographer. That is, you're trying to understand about your students and how they interact with each other as much as possible. So one particular mantra is find out about your students as much as you can, because that information will help you in many ways. And one way is it will help you in putting together different personalities. Once you've understood who your students are, what their interests are, it might help you put together pairs and groups. Another important thing to think about here in terms of pair work, group work, is one variable is not so much the whether a person is dominant, as to what tasks do they have in the pair work. So one thing that's important is perhaps giving to a quieter student a greater task in the sense that they have more information to communicate than, say, the person who is usually pretty dominant. So that means that the dominant speaker is more of the interviewer, and they need to get information out of the quieter student who has been given more information. So that's a kind of thinking in terms of the communication gap as being tilted towards the quieter student who has more information to give to the other students. Kathryn asks, how can we best use what we have learnt about group work to aid in the teaching of second language speaking? What are the best group activities, and how can we set out the classroom to ensure it's more interactive and encouraging for students who are more shy about speaking in a second language? I mentioned one factor there about working with shy students, that is giving them different tasks or different information in a communication gap activity. Here's one other thing about shy students, um, and it's something that connects with the last question I talked about, that is getting to know your students. A colleague of mine had a practice of encouraging his students to bring in music, the music they liked. He did this because he understood that students, especially younger students, make a great identification between music and themselves, right? So your musical choices are an extension of who you are as a person. Um, so he would ask them to bring that in, and he would play that music. It didn't have, didn't, it didn't, wasn't really important that it was in English, although that would help. But the way he used it was very interesting, because whenever there was a pair work, work activity, he would play the music in the background. And that fulfilled a couple of purposes. It validated the student who had brought that music in. They could feel proud that the teacher was playing their music in the classroom. And it also created a screen, so that shyer students could feel as though they could speak and other students could not overhear what they were saying. So it's a very interesting idea in many, many particular ways. So that's just one particular way of dealing with that. I'll talk a bit more about types of uh, uh, group and pair work in the next question. So Bailey says, of all the different group work choices that are listed in chapter 14, have any of them been determined to be the most successful when it comes to facilitating second language use among students? If not most successful, then maybe more successful. I would be willing to wager that whichever one is determined to be the most enjoyable for the students would be deemed the most successful technique. But I can't help wondering if there is any sort of research or scientific evidence that has determined otherwise. Well, yeah, a lot of research, especially on notions of the interaction hypothesis, and this is the kind of stuff that you'll be hearing about or have already heard about in the second language acquisition class, theories of language learning. Um, and what a lot of the research is focused upon is the ability to negotiate meaning and the ability to modify interaction. So that speaks to the way that we repair things that we've said. What I mean to say is the way that we ask for clarification. I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Could you say that again? Um, and these kinds of interactional modifications tend to appear more in particular communication gap activities which involve the expression of an opinion or expression of a particular piece of personal information. So you'll hear more about this in the listening activities and also in the speaking, is the and we've talked about it in reading, is the powerful notion of personalization. What experiences do your students have of the particular content of a reading or a speaking activity? And that can be something that they can collect, make notes about, and then exchange in a pair work activity with another student. So when you're communicating things which are personal, or communicating things which are based on opinions, they have higher communicative value to the students involved, as opposed to information gaps when we just exchanging a particular information gap about, say, um, giving directions, okay, which is really informational rather than interactional in the sense of communicating ideas, values, personal information. Anthony asks, how do you see your role in the classroom if you're already teaching? If not, what do you envision your role as a teacher to be? Controller, director, manager, facilitator, resource. How would you adjust when teaching different levels from beginner to advanced? Um, you might also throw in there age and also contrast EFL situations with ESL situations. So with younger students, you might see yourself more as a controller, and that becomes obviously more important. With more advanced students, you might see yourself more as a resource. And depending on your particular goals, so if your goals is the development of spoken communication, then you might see yourself more as a facilitator of communicative activities. So these particular roles are going to vary according to all these different variables, okay, about the particular goal, teaching goal of the class, the age of the class, the proficiency of the class, etc. Okay, thank you for your questions, and I look forward to the questions for discussion board 4.